The scar runs horizontal across my abdomen, about 8 inches long. In certain lights, it looks like a seam, as if I'm a doll that's been taken apart and put back together. Dr. Rashid told me it would fade to a thin white line within 2 years. He was right about the color but wrong about everything else. Some scars fade on the surface while burrowing deeper inside. I trace it sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment. The raised tissue has a different texture than the rest of my skin, smoother, somehow, like scar tissue has no memory of what came before. I wish I could say the same for myself. My name is Chloe Reeves, and 3 years ago, I gave half my liver to my mother-in-law. 2 weeks after the surgery, while I was still sleeping 16 hours a day and living on prescription painkillers, my husband filed for divorce. This is not a story about revenge, though it starts that way. This is a story about learning the difference between justice and vindication, and discovering that sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I met Adrian Valerius when I was 24, working the front desk at the Meridian Gallery in downtown Seattle. It was a small contemporary art space, the kind that hosted opening receptions with cheap wine and ambitious artist statements. I'd taken the job after dropping out of my MFA program, unable to justify the debt for a degree that would likely lead to more gallery desk jobs. Adrian came in on a Wednesday afternoon in October. I remember because Wednesdays were always dead, and I was reading a biography of Artemisia Gentileschi, my lunch getting cold beside me. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he moved through the space with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "The Rothko is a print," he said, stopping in front of our centerpiece. I looked up from my book. "The label says." "I know what the label says." He turned to face me, and I got my first real look at him. Dark hair, careful grooming, a face that was handsome in a practiced way. "But it's a high-quality print. You can see it in the texture. Rothko's originals have depth. The paint is built up in layers. This is flat." He was right. I'd wondered about it myself, but hadn't wanted to question my boss. "You know your art," I said carefully. "My family collects." He walked over to the desk, glanced at my book. "Gentileschi, Judith slaying Holofernes." The biography covers all her work, but yes, that's my favorite. "Revenge painting," he said, smiling. "A woman decapitating her rapist. It's not subtle. It's not supposed to be." Something shifted in his expression, a spark of genuine interest replacing polite small talk. "I'm Adrian," he said, extending his hand. "Chloe." His handshake was firm but not aggressive. Later, I would learn that everything about Adrian was carefully calibrated, his pressure, his timing, his smile. But that afternoon, I just thought I'd met someone interesting. Someone who saw me as more than the girl behind the desk. He asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes. That evening stretched into dinner, and dinner turned into a walk along the waterfront, talking about art and ambition and the gap between what we wanted and what we thought we deserved. He told me about his family's pharmaceutical company, Valerius Biotech, and how he'd spent his 20s trying to find his own identity outside of corporate boardrooms. I told him about growing up in Spokane, my mother who cleaned houses and my father who drove long-haul trucks, and how I'd been the first in my family to go to college. "That must have been isolating," he said. "Being the first. No one had ever framed it that way before. Most people said, 'You must be so proud,' or 'What an accomplishment.' But Adrian understood the other side, the loneliness of being the bridge between two worlds, belonging fully to neither." We were engaged 6 months later. Looking back, I can see how quickly it happened. How I was swept up not just in Adrian, but in the life he represented. The beautiful restaurants, the gallery openings where I was a guest instead of staff, the sense that I'd finally made it across some invisible threshold. But at the time, it felt like fate. Like I'd found someone who understood me. His mother, Evelyn Valerius, was a different story. I met Evelyn at Sunday brunch at their house in Bellevue, a modern glass and steel structure overlooking Lake Washington. She was in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in cream linen, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob. Everything about her was precise and intentional, from her posture to her word choice. "Chloe," she said, taking my hand briefly.
Her grip was cool and dry.
Adrian has told me so much about you. The phrase was warm, but her tone was appraising. I felt immediately self-conscious about my Target dress and scuffed ballet flats. It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Valerius. Evelyn, please. She smiled, showing perfect teeth. Let's have lunch on the terrace. The meal was a masterclass in polite interrogation. She asked about my family, translation. What's your background? My education, translation. Are you qualified to be here? And my plans, translation. Do you have ambitions beyond marrying my son? I tried to match her sophistication, to show her I wasn't intimidated, but I could feel myself performing, sitting straighter, choosing my words carefully, laughing at precisely the right moments. Adrian seemed oblivious to the subtext, or perhaps he was so used to his mother's manner that he didn't notice. He talked about our engagement, his hand finding mine across the table. Evelyn watched this gesture with an expression I couldn't quite read. How lovely, she said. When are you thinking for the wedding? We haven't set a date yet, I said. We're thinking small. Maybe next spring. Small? She repeated, as if tasting the word. Well, that's very modern. Though the Valerius name does come with certain expectations. People will want to celebrate with you. It was the first of many gentle corrections, suggestions phrased as concern, criticism dressed up as advice. Over the following months, as Adrian and I planned our small courthouse wedding, which somehow grew into a 100-person event, I learned to recognize Evelyn's pattern. She would defer to my choices right up until the moment of implementation, then express worry about how it might look or concern about what people might think. She never directly overruled me. She just made her preferences clear and then waited for me to accommodate them, which I did. Every time. Adrian told me I was overthinking it. She's just protective, he said. Give it time. She'll warm up once she sees how good we are together. So, I tried harder. I researched the charities Evelyn supported and volunteered my time. I took a wine appreciation class so I could hold my own at their dinner parties. I learned to navigate the unspoken rules of their world, when to speak, when to listen, how to dress, which topics were acceptable for discussion. I became fluent in the language of their class, even as I remained an immigrant who would never quite lose her accent. And slowly, incrementally, I felt Evelyn's approval. She began consulting me on small decisions, which caterer to use for an event, whether a painting should go in the living room or the study. She introduced me to her friends as Adrian's wonderful fiancé. She even gave me a bracelet on my birthday, a delicate silver piece with a small sapphire. It's been in the family for 3 generations, she said as I opened the box. I wore it at my own wedding. I was so moved, I nearly cried. Finally, I thought. Finally, I'm being accepted. It wasn't until much later that I learned there were 2 versions of that bracelet, the original, which was locked in a safe deposit box, and a replica that Evelyn had made for everyday wear. She'd given me the copy. We were married on a Saturday in June at a country club overlooking Puget Sound. The ceremony was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, impressive but impersonal. I wore a dress that Evelyn's designer friend had insisted on giving me at cost, which was still more than I'd ever spent on anything. My parents flew in from Spokane, looking uncomfortable in their formal clothes, taking pictures of everything like tourists. This is really something, honey, my mother whispered during the reception, gesturing at the flower arrangements that cost more than her monthly mortgage. It is. I agreed, but I felt the distance opening between us, not just physical space, but something more fundamental. I was becoming someone they didn't quite recognize, and I wasn't sure I recognized myself either. Adrian and I honeymooned in Italy, then settled into the guest house on his family's property. It was supposed to be temporary, just until we found our own place in the city, but weeks turned into months. The guest house was beautiful, a 3-bedroom cottage with its own garden, but it sat within view of the main house. I felt Evelyn's presence constantly, a benevolent surveillance that made it impossible to fully relax. Adrian traveled frequently for work, attending pharmaceutical conferences and meeting with investors. When he was gone, I was alone in the guest house or invited up to the main house for dinner with Evelyn. These meals were pleasant but exhausting. She would ask about my day, working part-time at a different gallery now, something I could do remotely. My plans vague, uncertain, my thoughts on various topics, carefully modulated to match her worldview. You know, she said one evening over salmon and asparagus, Adrian really values his independence. He's always been that way, even as a boy. He needs someone who can be self-sufficient, who doesn't need constant reassurance. Of course, I said, though I felt the criticism beneath the observation. I'd been calling Adrian too much while he traveled. I needed to need him less. And family is so important to him, she continued. His father died when Adrian was 12. It's just been the two of us for so long. That bond is special. The message was clear. Adrian's primary loyalty was to his mother, and I needed to accept my place in that hierarchy.
So I did.
I called less. I asked for less. I molded myself into the shape of a space I hadn't realized was already occupied. The diagnosis came 14 months into our marriage. Adrian called me from the hospital, his voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. It's Mom. She collapsed at work. They're running tests, but they think it might be her liver. I drove to the hospital immediately, my heart pounding. Whatever complicated feelings I had about Evelyn, I didn't want her to be sick. I found Adrian in the waiting room, his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red. They're saying cirrhosis, he said. Advanced stage. She'll need a transplant. The next weeks were a blur of appointments and second opinions. The consensus was unanimous. Evelyn's liver was failing, and without a transplant, she had maybe 18 months to live. The cause was a rare autoimmune condition. Nothing she'd done, just cruel genetic lottery. She needed to be put on the transplant list, but with her blood type and the severity of her condition, the wait could be years. Years she might not have. Adrian became someone I barely recognized. The confident man who'd walked into my gallery was replaced by someone hollow-eyed and frantic. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. He spent every day at his mother's side, holding her hand, researching experimental treatments, calling in favors from every medical connection the family had. We'll find a donor, he kept saying. We'll find someone. I held him while he cried. I brought him food he didn't eat. I felt helpless and peripheral, watching him suffer, without knowing how to help. And beneath my concern was a terrible, guilty thought. I was relieved to see proof that he could love this deeply, that he had this much feeling in him. Our marriage had been pleasant but passionless, and I'd begun to wonder if Adrian was capable of real intensity. Now I knew he was, just not for me. The idea came to me at 3 a.m, lying awake while Adrian slept fitfully beside me. I'd been researching living liver donation, trying to understand the process, the risks, the requirements. I learned that living donors could give a portion of their liver to someone in need, that the organ would regenerate in both donor and recipient, that it was a viable alternative to waiting for a deceased donor. I learned that I was a universal donor, O-negative blood type, and I learned that this might be my chance to finally, truly become part of this family, to prove my worth in a way that couldn't be questioned or diminished. If I saved Evelyn's life, how could she ever see me as anything less than a daughter? The thought lodged in my chest like a seed, growing roots. I brought it up carefully the next morning. Adrian was getting ready for another hospital visit, moving through our bedroom like a ghost. I've been reading about living donation, I said. He paused, shirt half buttoned. Chloe.
I'm O-negative.
I could be tested. Absolutely not. He said it sharply, definitively. The surgery is major. There are risks. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head dropping forward. Why would you even consider this? Because I love you. Because I want to help. Because I need to matter to this family in a way that feels permanent. I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said, because she's family. The testing process took 3 weeks. Blood work, psychological evaluation, imaging studies, more blood work. Every test came back the same. I was an excellent match. Better than excellent. Perfect. The transplant team called it remarkable compatibility. Adrian still resisted. You don't have to do this. We can keep looking for other options. But Evelyn's condition was deteriorating. She'd been hospitalized twice more, her skin taking on a yellowish tint, her energy depleting. The doctors said they were running out of time. I went to visit her alone one afternoon. She was in her bedroom in the main house, propped up on pillows, looking smaller and frilier than I'd ever seen her. When I told her I wanted to be her donor, she stared at me for a long moment. "You would do that?" Her voice was hoarse. "You would go through surgery, take that risk for me?" "Yes," I said simply. Her eyes filled with tears, the first real emotion I'd seen from her that wasn't carefully managed. She reached for my hand, gripping it with surprising strength. I know I haven't always been as welcoming as I should have been," she said. "I'm protective of Adrian. His father's death was hard on both of us, and I've held on too tightly. But this, what you're offering, I don't have words for it." She pulled me into a hug, and I felt something in my chest finally unlock. This was what I'd been working toward for 2 years. Acceptance. Belonging.
Love.
"You're saving my life," she whispered against my hair. "You're giving me a future. I will never forget this. Never." The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday in October. The night before, Adrian and I stayed up late in the guest house. He'd been tender these past weeks, more affectionate than he'd been in months. He held me close, ran his fingers through my hair, told me over and over how grateful he was. "After this is done," he said, "after you've recovered and Mom is better, let's get our own place. In the city. Start fresh. Maybe even talk about starting a family." I'd been wanting to have that conversation for months, but the timing had never felt right. Now here he was, offering me everything I wanted. "I'd like that," I whispered. "I love you, Chloe. I don't say it enough, but I do. You're extraordinary. Not many people would do what you're doing." I fell asleep in his arms, feeling certain I was making the right choice. The surgery took 11 hours. I remember being wheeled into the pre-op area, Adrian walking beside the gurney, holding my hand. Evelyn was already in surgery. They'd taken her first. The anesthesiologist was talking me through the procedure, but I couldn't focus on his words. I just kept looking at Adrian, trying to memorize his face. "I'll be right here when you wake up," he promised. Then the four pushed warmth through my veins, and everything went dark. I woke up to pain unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the sharp pain of an injury, but a deep, whole-body agony that made breathing difficult. A nurse was checking my vitals, her voice soothing but distant. I tried to ask about Evelyn, but my throat was raw from the breathing tube. "The transplant was successful," the nurse said, understanding my garbled question. "Both surgeries went well. You're in recovery now. Just rest." Adrian wasn't there. I learned later he'd been with Evelyn in her recovery room. Of course he had been. She was his mother. She'd been the one dying. It was natural that he'd want to be with her. But some small part of me, drifting in a haze of morphine and pain, had hoped I might be his priority now. The first 3 days are mostly blank in my memory. I know Adrian visited, though I couldn't tell you what we talked about. I know the surgical team came by to check the incision, to monitor for complications. I know the pain was managed but never quite controlled, a constant background radiation that colored everything. On the 4th day, I was coherent enough to ask questions. Evelyn's surgery had been a complete success. She was already showing signs of improved liver function. The prognosis was excellent. I cried with relief, and the nurse, a kind woman named Susan with gray streaks in her hair, held my hand and told me I was a hero. By the 5th day, I could sit up for short periods. They wanted me walking soon to prevent blood clots and speed recovery. Adrian came by in the morning, but he seemed distracted. "How's your mom?" I asked.
Good.
"Really good. The doctors are amazed at how well she's responding." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She'll probably go home before you do." Something in his tone made me uneasy, but I couldn't identify what. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the pain medication was making me paranoid. "When I get out of here," I said, reaching for his hand, "we should start looking at apartments." "Yeah," he said vaguely. "We should talk about that." He left 20 minutes later, saying he needed to get back to his mother. On the 6th day, Adrian came into my room carrying a leather portfolio. He didn't sit down. He stood at the foot of my bed, and something about his posture, rigid, formal, sent ice through my veins.
Chloe, he said.
My mother is going to make a full recovery. That's wonderful, I said, trying to sit up straighter, ignoring the pull of stitches. It is. She has her life back. Thanks to you. He paused, and in that pause, I felt the ground beginning to shift. I want you to know how grateful we are. How grateful I am. The past tense of his phrasing didn't register immediately. I was too focused on the portfolio in his hands. I've had my lawyers draw up some papers, he continued. Given everything you've done for our family, we want to make sure you're taken care of. He opened the portfolio and removed a document, placing it on my bedside table. I stared at the header. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words didn't make sense. I read them again, certain I was misunderstanding. Dissolution. Marriage. Adrian. My voice sounded very small. What is this? You've given us an incredible gift, he said, and his tone was so calm, so reasonable. And we want to honor that. The settlement is generous. More than generous. You'll be financially comfortable for years. You won't have to worry about anything. I don't understand. I was shaking now, the heart monitor beside me beginning to beep faster. You're divorcing me? This was always going to be complicated, he said, as if explaining something simple to a child. Our marriage was a mistake. I think we both knew that. We were different people pretending to be compatible. But you did this extraordinary thing, and for that, you deserve to be free. To start over. Free? I repeated dumbly. Sign the papers, Chloe. My lawyers will handle everything. You won't have to do anything except move forward with your life. He was leaving. He was actually turning toward the door, preparing to walk out. Wait, I said, my voice breaking. Adrian, wait. Please. I don't. This doesn't make sense. Last week you were talking about us getting our own place, starting a family. He stopped, his back to me. For a moment, I thought he might turn around, might explain this was all a terrible misunderstanding. I said what I needed to say to keep you calm before the surgery, he said quietly. Stress isn't good for donors. I needed you to feel secure. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Every tender word, every promise, every moment of intimacy in those final weeks, all of it had been performance. Management. He'd been handling me the way you'd handle a nervous horse before a race. Get out, I whispered. Chloe, get out. The shout tore something in my throat, but I didn't care. Get the fuck out of my room. He left. The door closed with a soft click, and I was alone with the divorce papers and the beeping of machines and a pain that had nothing to do with surgery. Susan found me 20 minutes later, sobbing so hard I was hyperventilating. She called for a doctor, but what I needed was a medical. What I needed was to undo the past 2 years, to go back to that Wednesday afternoon in October and tell the man in the expensive suit that the Rothko was a print and then watch him leave without giving him my name. They increased my pain medication. I slept for 16 hours straight. When I woke up, there was a check on my bedside table. $200,000. Payment for services rendered. I stared at it until the numbers blurred, trying to calculate what my liver was worth per gram, per ounce, per piece of my faith in humanity. A hospital social worker came by that afternoon. She'd been briefed on my situation and wanted to discuss resources. Therapists who specialized in medical trauma, support groups for living donors, financial advisors who could help me manage my settlement. This is more common than you'd think, she said gently. Relationships that don't survive the stress of transplant. The surgery itself, the recovery, it can expose fault lines that were always there. I wanted to tell her this wasn't a relationship that couldn't survive stress. This was a relationship that had never been real in the first place. I wanted to explain how I'd been so careful, so eager to please, how I'd turned myself inside out trying to be the right kind of wife, and none of it had mattered because I'd never been a wife at all. I'd been a means to an end. But I just nodded and took her list of phone numbers, knowing I'd never call any of them. I was discharged from the hospital 8 days after the surgery. I had nowhere to go. The guest house belonged to the Valerius property, and Adrian made it clear I was no longer welcome there. The hospital social worker had found me a room in a recovery house that specialized in post-surgical patients. It was clean and basic, a single bed, a bathroom, a window that looked out on a parking lot. My parents wanted to fly out, but I told them not to. I couldn't face their questions, their pity, their confusion about how their daughter had ended up here. I told them Adrian and I were going through a rough patch, that we'd work it out, that they shouldn't worry. My mother, who'd never fully trusted the Valerius world, heard what I wasn't saying. "Come home," she said. "You can stay with us as long as you need." "I can't," I said. "I need to figure this out on my own." The truth was, I was ashamed. Ashamed that I'd been so easily manipulated, that I'd given so much for so little, that I hadn't seen what should have been obvious. Going back to Spokane would mean admitting complete failure, and I wasn't ready for that. The physical recovery was brutal. Everything hurt, standing, sitting, lying down. The incision burned and itched and pulled. I couldn't lift more than 10 pounds, couldn't drive, couldn't do much of anything except exist in discomfort and think about how spectacularly I'd fucked up my life. I signed the divorce papers on day 12. Not because I wanted to, but because Adrian's lawyer had made it clear that fighting would mean losing the settlement and probably being buried in legal fees I couldn't afford. I read through the entire document this time and found no hidden clauses, no buried traps, just a clean dissolution of our marriage and a payment that felt simultaneously too much and nowhere near enough. The day I mailed the signed papers back, I cashed the check and opened a new bank account. Looking at that balance, more money than I'd ever had in my life, I felt nothing. Not relief, not security, not even anger. Just a vast, echoing emptiness. Physical therapy started in week 3. A cheerful woman named Rita taught me exercises to rebuild my core strength, to manage the nerve pain, to slowly reclaim my body. She asked about my surgery, whether I donated to a family member, how they were doing now. My ex-husband's mother. I said. "She's fine. Full recovery." Rita's expression shifted, recognition dawning. Oh, honey. It was the first time I'd said it out loud. Ex-husband. The words felt foreign in my mouth. "I'm so sorry," Rita said. "That must be incredibly hard." "It is," I admitted. "You did a brave thing," she said firmly. "Whatever happened afterward doesn't change that. You saved someone's life." I wanted to believe her. But the truth was more complicated. Yes, I'd saved Evelyn's life. But I'd done it for the wrong reasons. Not out of pure altruism, but out of desperate need for acceptance. I'd traded a piece of my body for the promise of belonging, and when that promise turned out to be counterfeit, I was left with nothing but a scar and a checking account. By week 6, I was functional. I could walk without pain, sleep on my side, eat without nausea. The incision was healing well, a thick red line that would eventually fade to white. I felt stronger physically, but increasingly fragile emotionally. The shock was wearing off, giving way to something darker and more difficult. Rage. I was angry at Adrian for his calculated manipulation. I was angry at Evelyn for accepting my liver while knowing what her son was planning. But mostly, I was angry at myself for being so blindly, stupidly trusting. For wanting acceptance so badly that I'd ignored every warning sign, every moment of discomfort, every instinct that told me something was wrong. I needed to do something. The fury was consuming me from the inside, and if I didn't find a way to channel it, it would destroy me. That's when I hired a lawyer. Not to contest the divorce. That ship had sailed. But I wanted to understand my options, my rights, whether there was any legal recourse for what had been done to me. The lawyer, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Chun, listened to my story with a carefully neutral expression. "Did you sign any additional documents?" she asked. "Anything during your hospital stay besides the discharge papers?" "No," I said. "Just the divorce papers afterward." She made notes on her legal pad. "And the settlement. Did you feel coerced into accepting it?" "I felt like I didn't have a choice," I said. His lawyer implied that fighting would be worse for me financially. That's standard divorce negotiation, Patricia said carefully. I'm not hearing clear grounds for legal action. You entered into the donation voluntarily. There was no quid pro quo established beforehand, no explicit promise that your marriage would continue in exchange for the transplant. But he lied to me, I said. He pretended to want a future with me right up until the surgery was over. Lying in a relationship isn't illegal, she said gently. Even cruel lying. I understand how betrayed you must feel, but the legal system doesn't typically intervene in matters of emotional manipulation between spouses unless there's fraud or coercion related to specific contracts. I felt something inside me deflate, so there's nothing I can do. I didn't say that. Patricia leaned forward. You could speak publicly about what happened. Your story is yours to tell. But you'd need to be careful. Defamation laws protect people from false statements, and public figures have more resources to sue. If you go that route, everything you say would need to be demonstrably true. What would that accomplish? I asked. Truthfully? Probably not much legally. But sometimes victims of manipulation find that speaking their truth, even without legal remediation, helps them heal. It returns power to them. I left her office with more questions than answers. Could I really go public with the story? Did I want to? The thought of exposing my humiliation to strangers made me nauseated. But the alternative, carrying this rage silently, felt equally impossible. I spent the next 2 weeks in my recovery house room, thinking,
Processing.
trying to decide what kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of this. The easy path was to take the money and disappear. Move to a new city, start over, reinvent myself. The Valerius family had given me an exit that many people in bad marriages would envy. Clean, quick, financially painless. I could frame this as a lucky escape from people who weren't worthy of me. But that felt like letting them write the ending to my story. Like agreeing that what they'd done was acceptable, that I was the problem for expecting basic human decency from my spouse. The other path was harder. It meant staying visible, staying vocal, refusing to vanish quietly. It meant facing judgment, because no matter how sympathetically I told my story, there would be people who'd blame me for being naive, for not seeing the signs, for giving away a piece of myself without ironclad guarantees. I thought about Artemisia Gentileschi, painting her rapists had been sawed off by a determined woman. It wasn't subtle, Adrian had said. No, I thought. It wasn't. And maybe that was the point. Maybe sometimes you had to be unsubtle about your pain, had to paint it in vivid detail, to make people understand what had been done to you. On day 43 post-surgery, I made my decision. I started writing. Not for publication at first, just for myself. I needed to organize the timeline, to see it clearly from beginning to end. Meeting Adrian, the courtship, the engagement, Evelyn's diagnosis, the testing process, the surgery, the betrayal. I wrote about the small moments, the ones that seemed insignificant at the time, but in retrospect were warnings I'd ignored. Evelyn's copy of the family bracelet, Adrian's decreasing physical affection, the way they'd both become suddenly warmer once I was confirmed as a suitable donor. I wrote about my motivations too, the parts that made me uncomfortable to examine. How desperately I'd wanted to belong to their world. How I'd confused wealth and sophistication with virtue. How I'd performed a version of myself I thought they wanted instead of asking whether they deserved the real me. It took 3 weeks to write it all down. When I finished, I had 47 pages of raw truth. Messy, painful, sometimes contradictory. I wasn't a perfect victim in this narrative. I'd made mistakes, ignored instincts, prioritized acceptance over authenticity. But that didn't make what they'd done to me okay. I sent the document to Patricia Chun, asking her to review it for any legal landmines. She called me 2 days later. It's powerful, she said. And careful. You stick to verifiable facts, express your own feelings and interpretations, and don't make accusations you can't support. If you're serious about publishing this, you could. Where would I even publish it? There are medical ethics blogs, patient advocacy sites, even mainstream outlets that run first-person essays. With the Valerius name attached, it would likely get attention. My stomach clenched. Attention sounds terrifying. It would be, Patricia agreed. And once you do this, you can't take it back. Your name will be permanently linked to this story. Future employers, future partners, everyone will be able to find this. You need to be sure.
I thought about that.
Did I want to be Chloe Reeves, the woman who donated her liver to her mother-in-law and then got divorced? Was that an identity I could live with? But the alternative was being Chloe Reeves, the woman who quietly accepted abuse because she was too ashamed to speak. And I'd been that woman long enough. I'm sure, I said. The essay was published on a medical ethics website in January, 3 months post-surgery. I'd worked with an editor to shape it, to make it more accessible to readers who weren't familiar with living donation. We included information about donor rights, about the psychological screening process, which I'd passed, though in retrospect those screening questions had been woefully inadequate, about the gap between medical-informed consent and emotional-informed consent. I titled it The Weight of What We Give. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the essay had been shared thousands of times on social media. People reached out with their own stories, donors who'd been pressured by family members, people who'd made enormous sacrifices only to be discarded, medical professionals who'd witnessed similar dynamics but felt powerless to intervene. The comments section became a space for collective grief and rage. Some people praised my courage. Others criticized my naivety. A few accused me of trying to profit from tragedy, though I'd been paid nothing for the essay. But the majority simply said, "Thank you for speaking up." 3 days after publication, a reporter from the Seattle Times reached out. Then a producer from a medical ethics podcast. Then a literary agent who thought the story could be expanded into a book. I was invited to speak at a conference on living donation. A bioethics professor at UW wanted to use my essay in her course. The attention was dizzying and terrifying. I'd expected some response, but not this tidal wave. And with the attention came scrutiny of the Valerius family. Adrian stayed silent, but Evelyn issued a statement through Valerius Biotech's PR team. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. I am deeply grateful to Ms. Reeves for her generous gift, which saved my life. The dissolution of her marriage to my son is a private family matter, and I regret that our personal difficulties have been made public. Divorce is always painful, and I have only compassion for what Ms. Reeves has endured. I wish her every happiness in her future. It was perfect. She acknowledged my donation, expressed gratitude, claimed the high road, and subtly framed me as someone airing private grievances publicly. She came across as dignified and wounded. I came across as vindictive. The narrative started to shift in some quarters. Opinion pieces appeared questioning my motives for publishing the essay. Did women donate liver expecting marriage security? One headline asked. Another, the ethics of public divorce narratives. A particularly cruel blogger wrote, she signed up to be a living donor. She got $200,000 and a clean divorce. What's she complaining about? I'd known this would happen. Patricia had warned me, but reading it was still gutting. I wanted to respond to every criticism, to explain the nuances they were missing, to make people understand. But Patricia advised against it. You told your truth, she said. Now let it stand. Engaging with critics will only prolong the news cycle and make you look defensive. The people who get it, get it. The people who don't, probably never will. So I stayed silent and watched the discourse swirl around me like a storm I'd conjured but couldn't control. Then, 2 weeks after my essay published, something unexpected happened. A journalist named Marcus Chen, no relation to my lawyer, published an investigative piece in a medical industry publication. He'd been researching Valerius Biotech's business practices and had discovered something interesting. The company was developing a new immunosuppressant drug specifically designed for transplant patients. The drug was in late-stage trials, and early results were promising. If approved, it would be worth billions. Marcus connected the dots. Evelyn Valerius, CEO of a company developing transplant drugs, receives a living donor transplant herself. The personal narrative would be powerful marketing, a testament to the life-saving power of organ donation and the medications that make it possible. Her story made the science personal, relatable. One has to wonder, Marcus wrote, whether Ms. Reeves's donation served dual purposes, saving Mrs. Valerius's life and providing her company with a compelling patient story for their upcoming drug launch. I read the article 3 times, my hands shaking. I hadn't known about the drug. I hadn't connected those dots. But Marcus was right. Evelyn's recovery story would be invaluable for marketing. And as a living donor recipient, she could speak authentically about the importance of immunosuppressant therapy, about the gift of second chances, about the medical miracles that made transplantation possible. Had that been part of their calculation? Had they seen me not just as a donor, but as a PR opportunity? The article gained traction quickly. Bioethics experts weighed in, discussing the ethical implications of CEOs becoming poster patients for their own products. The FDA announced they'd be reviewing Valerius Biotech's trial data with extra scrutiny, given the potential conflicts of interest. Valerius Biotech's stock price dropped 8% in one day. Suddenly, I wasn't just a bitter ex-wife. I was a piece in a much larger story about pharmaceutical ethics, corporate exploitation, and the monetization of human suffering. The narrative shifted again, this time in my favor. Adrian finally broke his silence with a statement posted to his personal LinkedIn. I made mistakes in my marriage, and I take full responsibility for my actions. The timing of our divorce was poor, and I understand how it appeared to my ex-wife. But the suggestion that my mother or I engaged in any sort of conspiracy is both false and defamatory. Chloe's donation was voluntary, generous, and life-saving. The failure of our marriage was due to incompatibility, not malice. I wish her well and ask that the public respect our privacy as we both move forward. It was a calculated response, just enough contrition to seem human, just enough pushback to plant doubt. And it worked on some people. The comments on his post were mixed. Takes courage to admit mistakes. Respect. Incompatibility, my ass. You used her. Both sides have a point. Truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But the damage to the Valerius family's reputation was done. Whether or not there had been a conscious conspiracy, the optics were terrible. A pharmaceutical CEO receives an organ from her daughter-in-law, who is then divorced weeks later, just as the company is poised to launch a transplant drug. It looked bad because it was bad. I received a call from Marcus Chun, the journalist. "I'd like to do a follow-up interview with you," he said. "On the record. I think there's more to this story, and I'd like to give you a chance to expand on what you've already shared." I hesitated. Speaking to a journalist felt like escalation, like crossing a line from personal narrative into active exposure. But I also felt the momentum shifting in a direction I hadn't anticipated, and I wanted to maintain some control over my own story. "Okay," I said, "but I need to be careful. I can only speak to my own experience. That's all I'm asking for." We met at a coffee shop in Fremont. Marcus was in his 30s, serious but not unkind, with the cautious energy of someone who'd learned not to promise sources more than he could deliver. "Let's start with a timeline," he said, pulling out a recorder. "When did you first learn about Valerius Biotech's transplant drug?" "When I read your article," I said honestly. He made a note. "So, you had no knowledge of it during your marriage?"
None.
Adrian never discussed the specifics of company projects with me. I knew Valerius Biotech did pharmaceutical development, but that's it. Did either Adrian or Evelyn ever suggest using your donation story for publicity purposes? I thought back carefully. Not explicitly. But after the surgery, when I was still in the hospital, Evelyn mentioned something about wanting to give back by raising awareness about living donation. She said she'd been thinking about doing some advocacy work. At the time, I thought it was just her way of processing what had happened. Marcus nodded. Did she follow through on that? I don't know. We stopped speaking after Adrian filed for divorce. Did you ever feel pressure to donate? This was the question I'd been wrestling with since I published my essay. Not overtly, I said slowly. No one held a gun to my head, but there was context, emotional context. I was already feeling insecure in the marriage, already trying to prove my worth to Evelyn. When the opportunity to donate presented itself, it felt like a way to finally secure my place in the family. So was I pressured? Not technically. Was I manipulated? I think so. But I also manipulated myself. I saw what I wanted to see. Marcus studied me. That's a very honest answer. I'm trying to be honest about my own complicity, I said. I made a choice. It was based on incomplete information and emotional manipulation, but it was still my choice. I don't want to pretend I was a helpless victim. I just want people to understand how these situations can be more complex than they appear. He asked more questions about my recovery, about the financial settlement, about how I was doing now. I answered as truthfully as I could. When we finished, he turned off the recorder. For what it's worth, he said, I think you did something incredibly brave, both with the donation and with speaking out. Not many people would have the courage to examine their own mistakes this publicly. Sometimes I wonder if courage is just another word for stupidity, I said. He smiled. Maybe. But stupid people don't usually ask themselves that question. Marcus's follow-up article published a week later. It was balanced and thorough, laying out the timeline of events alongside the development of Valerius Biotech's transplant drug. He quoted bioethics experts about the gray areas in living donation, how difficult it is to ensure true informed consent when family dynamics and emotional leverage are involved. He quoted transplant surgeons about the need for better psychological screening. And he quoted me, accurately and fairly, acknowledging both what had been done to me and what I'd done to myself. The article generated another wave of attention, but this time it felt different. Less sensational, more substantive. It became part of a larger conversation about medical ethics and corporate responsibility. Valerius Biotech ultimately decided to delay their drug launch, citing the need for additional review of their trial data. Industry analysts speculated that they were trying to distance the product from Evelyn's personal story. The company's board quietly suggested that Evelyn might want to consider stepping back from her CEO role, at least temporarily. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. By spring, 6 months post-surgery, the media attention had died down. I was no longer Chloe Reeves, breaking news. I was just Chloe Reeves, trying to figure out what came next. I'd been living off the settlement money, but I couldn't do that forever. I needed purpose, structure, a reason to get out of bed that wasn't just fury or survival. I needed to rebuild my life from scratch. I started by moving out of the recovery house and into a small studio apartment in Capitol Hill. It was nothing like the guest house, barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette, but it was mine. I painted the walls a warm gray, bought secondhand furniture, hung prints that I actually liked instead of art that was appropriate. I made a home that reflected who I was, not who I thought I should be. Next, I needed work. My old gallery connections had dried up, and my name was now associated with scandal rather than expertise. I applied for positions at museums, galleries, arts nonprofits, all the places that would have hired me before, and received polite rejections or no response at all. Finally, I swallowed my pride and took a job at a corporate art consultancy, helping businesses select pieces for their office spaces. It was soulless work, matching color palettes to conference rooms, choosing inspiring pieces for lobbies, but it paid well and had health insurance. I needed both. My boss, a woman named Diane with expensive highlights and a relentlessly positive attitude, gave me my first assignment, sourcing art for a new pharmaceutical company's headquarters. They're a startup, lots of funding, want to make a statement, she said. Think cutting edge, optimistic, future forward. What company? I asked. Valerius Biotech. My stomach dropped. I can't take that account. Diane's smile faltered. Why not? I'd kept my job search carefully separate from my public story, using my maiden name on applications and hoping no one would connect the dots. But now I had to explain. I was married to Adrian Valerius, I said quietly. It ended badly. There's a conflict of interest. Diane's face went through several expressions: surprise, recognition, calculation. You're that Chloe? I'm that Chloe. She was silent for a moment, then, would you be comfortable if I assigned it to someone else?
Yes.
Thank you. She nodded slowly. I'll put Jessica on it. But Chloe, this industry is small. If you're going to stay in it, you'll probably cross paths with the Valerius name again. You might want to think about whether this is the right field for you. She wasn't being cruel. She was being practical. And she was right. The art world and the corporate world were full of people like the Valeriuses, wealthy collectors, pharmaceutical executives, tech CEOs who saw art as an investment or a status symbol. If I couldn't handle proximity to that world, I needed a different career. But I loved art. It was the one thing that had been mine before Adrian during my marriage and after it ended. I wasn't ready to give it up. I can handle it, I said. I just can't handle that specific account. Fair enough. I kept my head down and did my job. I sourced corporate art, managed installations, wrote descriptions about how abstract expressionism fostered creative thinking. It was boring, but it was stable, and stability felt precious after months of chaos. I also started therapy. Dr. Sarah Kim was in her 40s, with a direct manner that initially intimidated me. In our first session, she asked me what I wanted from therapy. "I want to stop being angry," I said. "Why?" The question surprised me, because being angry all the time is exhausting, because it's affecting my ability to move forward. "What if the anger is appropriate?" she asked. "What if it's your psyche's healthy response to betrayal?" I didn't have an answer. "I'm not suggesting you should stay angry forever," Dr. Kim continued. "But I am suggesting that trying to suppress appropriate anger might not be the healthiest goal. Maybe the work isn't getting rid of the anger. Maybe it's understanding it, directing it, and eventually transforming it into something productive." Over the next months, we unpacked everything. My childhood, my relationship with my parents, my patterns in romantic relationships, my desperate need for external validation, my tendency to prioritize other people's comfort over my own truth. "You've spent most of your life performing versions of yourself you thought would be acceptable to others," Dr. Kim observed. "The art student who wasn't too weird, the wife who wasn't too demanding, the donor who wasn't too complicated. When do you get to just be Chloe?" "I don't know," I admitted. "That's what we're going to figure out." The 1-year anniversary of my surgery arrived in October. I marked it privately, alone in my apartment, running my fingers over the scar. It had faded to a thin white line, just as Dr. Rashid had promised. The physical evidence was becoming less visible, even as the emotional evidence felt permanent. I thought about Evelyn. I wondered how she was doing, whether the transplant had held, whether she ever thought about me. I wondered if she felt any guilt, or if she'd rationalized everything to her satisfaction. I thought about Adrian, whether he'd moved on to someone new, someone more suitable to his world. Whether he ever regretted how he'd handled things, or if he'd simply filed me away as an unfortunate chapter in his life story. Mostly, I thought about the Chloe who'd walked into that hospital a year ago. The one who'd believed love meant sacrifice, that acceptance required payment, that she needed to earn her place in other people's lives. I felt tender toward her, the way you'd feel toward a child who doesn't yet know how the world works. She'd been naive and desperate and trying so hard. She'd deserved better than what she got. But she'd also been complicit in her own exploitation. She'd ignored red flags, performed authenticity, prioritized belonging over being known. And until I could forgive her for that, I wouldn't be free. Dr. Kim and I talked about this in therapy. "Forgiveness is hard," she said, "especially self-forgiveness. Because when we forgive ourselves, we have to accept that we made the best choices we could with the information and psychological resources we had at the time. And that means accepting our own limitations." "I should have seen it," I said. "All the signs were there. And you were a 26-year-old from a working-class background, trying to navigate a world you'd never been part of, married to a man who'd been trained his entire life to manage perceptions. The power differential was enormous. Yes, you missed signs. But they also worked very hard to hide what they were doing. Both things can be true. How do I forgive myself for being naive? By recognizing that naivety isn't a moral failing. It's a temporary condition that experience corrects. You're not naive anymore, Chloe. You learned. The question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned? I decided to volunteer. There was a nonprofit in Seattle called Living Donor Support Network that provided resources and counseling for people considering living donation. They'd reached out after my essay published, asking if I'd be willing to speak with prospective donors who had questions or concerns. I said yes. Once a month, I met with people who were considering donating kidneys, liver segments, or bone marrow to family members, friends, sometimes strangers. I didn't try to talk anyone out of donation. That wasn't my role. But I asked questions. Hard questions. Why do you want to do this? What happens to your relationship with this person if you don't donate? What happens if you do donate and the relationship changes? Have you thought about how you'll feel if you're treated differently afterward? Do you have support systems outside of this relationship? Some people had clear, healthy motivations. They wanted to help someone they loved. They'd thought through the implications. They had realistic expectations. Those people I encouraged. But others were like I'd been. Donating out of fear or obligation or desperate hope that this would fix something broken. Those people I tried to slow down, to help them see what they might be missing. One woman, Sarah, was considering donating a kidney to her sister. But as we talked, it became clear that her sister was emotionally abusive, that Sarah had spent her life trying to earn her sister's approval, that this donation felt like one more attempt to win love that was being deliberately withheld. What if you donate and nothing changes? I asked gently. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Then at least I'll know. I tried everything. Or, I said, you could recognize that you've already tried everything. That you've given and given and given, and it hasn't been enough because the problem isn't you. It's her. Sarah didn't donate. She sent me an email 6 months later thanking me, telling me she'd started therapy, that she was learning to set boundaries with her sister, that she'd realized she didn't have to sacrifice her body to prove her worth. Those emails made everything I'd been through feel less pointless. If my disaster could prevent someone else's, maybe there was meaning in it. 18 months post-surgery, I was invited to speak at a medical conference about living donation. It was a panel on donor experiences, and I'd be speaking alongside 2 other donors and moderated by a transplant surgeon. I almost said no. The idea of standing on a stage, talking about my experience to a room full of medical professionals, terrified me. But my therapist encouraged me to consider it. You've been working on reclaiming your narrative, Dr. Kim said. This is an opportunity to do that in a setting where you have expertise and authority. These doctors need to hear from donors, especially donors who've had complicated experiences. So I agreed. The conference was in Portland. I took the train down, stayed in a modest hotel, practiced my talking points. The panel was scheduled for the second day of the conference, in a large ballroom with rows of seats. I was nervous until I walked into the room and saw the faces. These weren't people judging me or looking for gossip. They were transplant coordinators, surgeons, psychologists, social workers, people who spent their careers navigating the messy human realities of organ donation. They wanted to learn. The moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Santos, introduced each of us. The first donor, Marcus, had donated a kidney to his brother 15 years ago. They'd had a great experience, stayed close, no complications. He was the success story. The second donor, Jennifer, had donated part of her liver to her adult daughter. The surgery had been rough, but the relationship had survived and eventually strengthened. She was the complicated but positive story. Then there was me. Dr. Santos introduced me carefully. Chloe Reeves donated part of her liver to her mother-in-law. Her experience was difficult in ways that many in this field don't often discuss publicly. Chloe, thank you for being willing to share your story. I talked for 10 minutes. I kept it clinical, the timeline, the decision-making process, the psychological screening I'd undergone, which had failed to identify my underlying motivations, the surgery, the immediate aftermath, the long-term emotional impact. Then I talked about what could have been done differently. Better psychological screening, I said. Not just, are you crazy, but deeper questions about relationship dynamics, about motivations, about support systems. Someone should have asked me hard questions about why I was so eager to donate to someone I'd known for less than 2 years, someone I had a complicated relationship with. I talked about post-donation support. Once the surgery is over, donors often feel abandoned by the medical system. We're left to process complex emotions about our bodies, about our relationships, about whether we made the right choice, without adequate resources. That needs to change. And I talked about power dynamics. Living donation happens within relationships, and relationships have power imbalances. Family pressure, guilt, financial dependence, immigration status, all sorts of factors can compromise someone's ability to truly consent. We need to acknowledge that and build in safeguards. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and others joined in. It wasn't triumphant applause. It was the kind of serious, thoughtful acknowledgement that said, "We hear you. This matters. We'll do better." During the Q&A, a transplant surgeon raised his hand. "I've been doing this work for 20 years, he said. And I've seen situations like yours, where the donor's motivations are complex and the post-donation relationship fails. But I've struggled with how to address it without seeming to question someone's altruism. How do we ask the hard questions without making donors feel interrogated or doubted?" "You reframe it," I said. "You don't question their altruism. You help them interrogate their own motivations. You say, 'Tell me about your relationship with this person. Tell me about a time you disagreed. Tell me what happens if this doesn't fix what you hope it will fix.' You make it a collaborative exploration, not an inquisition." Another hand went up from a woman who identified herself as a social worker. "What would you say to donors who are currently in similar situations, who've donated and are now facing relationship difficulties?" I thought about Sarah, about the other people I'd spoken with through the support network. I'd say, "Your donation was valuable whether or not the relationship survived. You saved or improved someone's life. That's real. That matters. And also, you don't have to stay in relationships that hurt you just because you gave someone an organ. The gift was given. It doesn't create a lifetime obligation." After the panel ended, people came up to talk to me. Transplant coordinators who wanted to improve their screening processes. Researchers studying donor outcomes. Other donors who'd had difficult experiences and felt alone in them. One surgeon, an older man with kind eyes, shook my hand and said, "Thank you for making us uncomfortable. We need that." On the train back to Seattle, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the desperate, needy pride I'd felt when I was trying to impress the Valeriuses, but a quiet, solid pride in who I was becoming. Someone who could stand in front of experts and speak difficult truths. Someone who could transform her pain into something useful. I was starting to understand what Dr. Kim meant about transforming anger. The rage hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into something more focused. Not revenge. I didn't want to destroy the Valeriuses anymore, but justice. I wanted to change the systems that had failed me. I wanted to prevent what had happened to me from happening to others. That became my focus. 2 years post-surgery, I made a major life change. I quit the corporate art consultancy and enrolled in a graduate program in bioethics at the University of Washington. It was a risk. I'd be taking on student loans again, investing years in education that might not lead to stable employment. But I'd realized that I couldn't just talk about these issues. I needed to develop real expertise to understand the legal and ethical frameworks to be able to propose actual solutions. My parents thought I was crazy. "You finally have stability," my mother said when I told her. "Why would you give that up?" "Because I found something I care about more than stability." She was quiet for a moment then. "You're different than you used to be. Is that good or bad? I don't know yet.
But you seem solid.
Like you know who you are." It was the best compliment she could have given me. The program was intense. Classes on medical ethics, research methodology, healthcare law, philosophical frameworks for moral decision-making. I studied cases of exploitation in medical research, looked at how consent is compromised in various contexts, learned about the history of medical ethics violations that had led to current protective regulations. And I focused my research on living donation. For my thesis project, I interviewed 50 living donors about their experiences. Not just their physical outcomes, but their emotional ones, their motivations, their regrets, their relationships with recipients, the gap between their expectations and reality. The data was complex and messy, but patterns emerged. Donors who'd been given time and space to make autonomous decisions generally had positive experiences, even when complications arose. Donors who'd felt pressured, whether explicitly or through subtle family dynamics, often struggled emotionally, even when the physical outcomes were good. And donors who'd been made to feel their worth was contingent on donation, they almost universally experienced lasting psychological harm. I wasn't the only one. I was just the one who'd had the resources and platform to speak about it publicly. My research got attention. I presented at conferences, published in bioethics journals, consulted with transplant centers trying to improve their donor evaluation processes. I became, somewhat ironically, an expert in the thing that had nearly destroyed me. 3 years post-surgery, I ran into Adrian. It was completely accidental. We were both at a coffee shop in Fremont, waiting for our orders. I saw him first, and my immediate instinct was to leave. But then I thought, no, I have just as much right to be here as he does. I'm not going to run. So I stayed. And, inevitably, our eyes met. He looked older. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his careful grooming seemed more like armor now, less like style. He hesitated, clearly debating whether to acknowledge me, then made his decision and walked over. "Chloe," he said quietly. "Adrian." An excruciating silence. The barista called someone else's name, and we both flinched. "How have you been?" he asked finally.
Good.
"Busy. I'm in graduate school." I heard. "Bioethics, right?" At my surprised look, he added, "I've followed your work. The paper you published on donor autonomy, it was good." I didn't know what to do with that information. "Thank you. I've wanted to reach out," he said, "but I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me." "I wouldn't have," I said honestly. 2 years ago, I would have hung up immediately. And now, I considered. Now I can stand here and have this conversation without feeling like I'm going to shatter. So that's progress. He nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology. A real one, not the performative statement my lawyer crafted. What I did, how I handled everything was cruel. I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway because it was easier for me. And I'm sorry." I'd imagined this moment countless times. In some versions, I raged at him. In others, I coldly dismissed him. But now that it was happening, I just felt tired. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you marry me if you were never serious about it?" "I was serious," he said. "At first. But my mother," he stopped, shook his head. "That's not fair. My mother didn't make me do anything. I made my own choices. But yes, she influenced me. She always has. And when she got sick, when it became clear she needed a transplant, she suggested that you might be willing to test. And when you turned out to be a match, she told me how important it was to keep you emotionally stable through the process. So you performed affection."
No. Yes.
"It's complicated." He rubbed his face. "Some of it was performance. The talk about moving, about kids, that was me saying what needed to be said. But some of it was real. I did care about you, Chloe. Just not enough. Not enough to stand up to my mother or to prioritize your well-being over her recovery. And I'm sorry for that." The barista called my name. I collected my coffee and Adrian collected his. We stood there, two people who'd once been married, now strangers with history. "How's your mom?" I asked. "Healthy." The transplant held. He paused. "She's not the same person she was. The scandal affected her. She stepped down from the company. She's doing advocacy work now, ironically, for transplant awareness." I must have made a face because he said, "I know. The optics are terrible. But I think she's trying to make amends in the only way she knows how." "Is she?" "I think so. I hope so." He looked at me directly. "For what it's worth, I think she regrets what happened. Not the donation. She'll always be grateful for that. But how it ended. What it cost you. Tell her she can keep her regrets," I said. "I don't need them." Fair. We stood there another moment, the conversation clearly over, but neither of us quite willing to walk away first. "I really am sorry," Adrian said again. "I know," I said. And I did. I believed his apology was genuine, that he'd grown enough to recognize what he'd done. But that didn't mean I forgave him, or that his regret changed anything. "Take care, Adrian." "You too." I walked out of the coffee shop feeling strange, not devastated, not triumphant, just settled. The ghost I'd been carrying had materialized, apologized, and revealed itself to be just a regular person who'd made terrible choices. There was something freeing in that. For years post-surgery, I completed my master's degree. My thesis, Coercion and Consent in Living Organ Donation, a study of donor experiences and ethical recommendations, was published in the Journal of Clinical Ethics. It got picked up by several major media outlets, and I did a round of interviews discussing the findings. I was offered a position at a bioethics think tank in Seattle, working on policies to improve living donor protections. It wasn't glamorous work, lots of committee meetings, policy drafts, stakeholder negotiations, but it was meaningful. We were developing frameworks that could actually change how transplant centers evaluated and supported donors. I also continued volunteering with Living Donor Support Network, now training other volunteers and developing their counseling protocols. My life was full and purposeful in ways it had never been during my marriage. I had work I cared about. I had colleagues who respected me. I had rebuilt myself into someone I could recognize and, increasingly, admire. Dating was complicated. I tried, but most relationships fizzled after a few weeks. It was partly logistics. I was busy, focused on my career, but it was also caution. I'd learned to move slowly, to pay attention to red flags, to prioritize compatibility over chemistry, which meant I was alone more often than not. Dr. Kim and I talked about this. "Do you want a relationship?" she asked. "I think so. Eventually. But I also don't want to settle, and I don't want to lose myself again. So if the choice is between being alone and being with someone who's wrong for me, I'll choose alone." "That's healthy," she said. "And also, you're only 30. You have time." "I know. But sometimes I worry that what happened with Adrian broke something in me, that I'll never be able to trust someone enough to really let them in." "Trust is a skill," Dr. Kim said. "And like any skill, you can develop it. But you're right to be selective about who you practice with. The next person you trust, if there is a next person, should earn it." 5 years post-surgery, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on healthcare policy. They were reviewing legislation related to living donation, specifically whether donors should receive financial compensation for their time and expenses, and whether more federal oversight was needed for transplant centers. I testified alongside transplant surgeons, ethicists, and other donors. My testimony focused on the need for better psychological screening, mandatory counseling for donors at multiple stages of the process, and long-term follow-up care. Living donation saves lives, I told the committee. But it also creates lasting impacts, physical, emotional, and financial, for donors. We ask people to make enormous sacrifices for others, but we don't always support them adequately afterward. That needs to change. The legislation didn't pass that session, but it laid groundwork for future reform. And my testimony was entered into the congressional record, a permanent artifact of my evolution from victim to advocate. I'm 31 now, 6 years post-surgery. The scar has faded to almost nothing. You have to know where to look to see it. But I still run my fingers over it sometimes, feeling the slight ridge under my skin, remembering who I was and who I've become. Last month, I got a letter from Evelyn. It was handwritten, on expensive stationery, several pages long. I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won. She wrote about the years since her transplant, how the scandal had forced her to confront parts of herself she'd been avoiding for decades, how stepping down from the company had been humiliating but ultimately liberating, how she'd spent years in therapy examining her relationships with her sons, including the one she'd driven away with her controlling behavior. She wrote about Adrian, who was apparently also in therapy, working through patterns of people-pleasing and avoidance that she acknowledged she'd instilled in him. And she wrote about me. I told myself that what we did was acceptable because the outcome was good. I am alive. The transplant saved me. Therefore, the means were justified by the ends. But I have come to understand that this reasoning was morally corrupt. You were not a means to an end. You were a person. And I treated you like a resource to be extracted and discarded. She apologized. Not the careful, PR-approved apology of her earlier statement, but a raw, specific accounting of everything she'd done wrong. I knew Adrian was planning to divorce you after the surgery. I didn't just fail to stop him. I encouraged him. I told him you were a good person who would land on her feet, as if my belief in your resilience made it acceptable to wound you. I was wrong. I was cruel. And I am genuinely sorry. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted me to know that she understood what she'd done and that she would carry the weight of it for the rest of her life. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it in a drawer and didn't look at it again for a week. When I finally took it out again, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because she'd apologized, her remorse didn't undo what had happened, but because she'd confirmed what I'd always suspected. It wasn't in my head. I hadn't imagined the manipulation. They'd known exactly what they were doing. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't need to. Her apology was hers to give, but what I did with it was my choice. And I chose to let it be information, not invitation. She could carry her guilt. I wasn't going to absolve her of it. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations or spectacular revenge. The villain gets their comeuppance. The hero triumphs. Justice is served in a blaze of righteous vindication. This isn't one of those stories. Evelyn Valerius is alive because of the organ I gave her. She'll probably live another 20 years. The transplant was a complete success. The medication keeps her body from rejecting my tissue, and the tissue regenerated in my own body until my liver was whole again. Physically, we're both fine. Adrian is, by all accounts, becoming a better person. His therapist is helping him understand why he was so susceptible to his mother's influence, why he chose compliance over authenticity, why he hurt me instead of standing up for our marriage. Maybe someday he'll be a good partner to someone else. Maybe he already is. Valerius Biotech survived the scandal. Their transplant drug was eventually approved, though the marketing never mentioned Evelyn's personal experience. The stock price recovered. The company is profitable again. The system absorbed my story and kept functioning. If you're looking for justice in the sense of punishment, you won't find it here. The Valeriuses weren't destroyed. They were inconvenienced, embarrassed, forced to reckon with themselves in ways they wouldn't have chosen. But they're still wealthy. They're still connected. They're still living in their beautiful houses overlooking the water. For a long time, this felt like failure. Like I'd spoken my truth and nothing had changed. Like the powerful stayed powerful and the vulnerable stayed vulnerable, and my voice had just been noise in a system designed to protect people like them. But I've come to understand justice differently. Justice isn't always spectacular. Sometimes it's incremental. It's the transplant coordinator who asks one more question because she read my paper. It's the donor who decides to wait, to think, to examine her motivations before committing to surgery. It's the hospital that updates its screening protocols. It's the legislation that doesn't pass this year but might pass in 5 years because people like me kept talking about it. Justice is also internal. It's knowing my own worth regardless of whether others recognize it. It's refusing to be defined by what was done to me. It's building a life that has meaning beyond my trauma. The Valeriuses took something from me, not just a piece of my liver, but years of my life, my trust in people, my faith in my own judgment. But they didn't take everything. They didn't take my mind, my ability to grow, my capacity to transform pain into purpose. And here's what I've learned. Revenge fantasies are satisfying but ultimately hollow. They keep you focused on the people who hurt you instead of on the person you want to become. They make you reactive instead of generative. They trap you in the worst chapter of your life instead of letting you write new ones. I don't forgive the Valeriuses, not in the sense of absolving them or pretending what they did was acceptable, but I've stopped needing them to be punished. Their punishment, or lack thereof, is irrelevant to my well-being. My peace doesn't depend on their suffering. That's harder than revenge. And it's more freeing. Last week, I met someone. His name is Daniel. He's a pediatric surgeon at Harborview, which is how we met. We were both on a hospital ethics committee, debating a complicated case involving parental consent. He argued thoughtfully and listened carefully and asked good questions. After the meeting, he asked if I wanted to get coffee. I almost said no. My instinct still is to protect myself, to avoid vulnerability, to keep people at arm's length where they can't hurt me. But I've been working on that in therapy. Learning to take calculated risks. Learning that not everyone who seems kind is hiding cruelty. So I said yes. We've been on 4 dates now. He's divorced. His ex-wife is a surgeon too, and they realized they loved each other better as colleagues than as spouses. He has 2 kids, shared custody, and talks about them with uncomplicated joy. He knows my story, the broad strokes at least. It's hard to date in Seattle's medical community without someone mentioning that you're the living donor who became a bioethicist. He asked me about it on our 2nd date, carefully, giving me space to share or not. I told him, not everything, not the rawest parts, but enough. He listened without interrupting, without offering solutions or judgments. That sounds incredibly painful, he said when I finished. And also, you seem like someone who's done real work to heal from it. That's admirable. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It was just acknowledgement of what I'd been through and who I was now. It felt more meaningful than any grand romantic gesture. I don't know if Daniel is my person. It's too early to tell. But I know that I'm capable of sitting across from someone, being honest about my past, and not falling apart. I know that I can be interested in someone without losing myself. I know that I'm not broken, just scarred, and scars can be touched without pain. I still think about the Chloe who walked into the Meridian Gallery that Wednesday afternoon, the one who looked up from her book when a stranger in an expensive suit criticized the Rothko. I feel tenderness toward her. She was looking for something, validation, belonging, love, and she thought she'd found it in the worst possible place. She made mistakes that cost her dearly, but she was also brave enough to be vulnerable, to take a chance, to believe in possibility. I wouldn't trade her mistakes for a different life. Those mistakes led me here, to work that matters, to a self I recognize, to the hard-won understanding that I am enough without external validation. The scar on my abdomen tells a story. It says, I gave something precious to someone who didn't deserve it. But it also says, I survived. I grew. I became someone who helps others avoid the same fate. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. There's a painting I love by Artemisia Gentileschi, not Judith slaying Holofernes, though I understand the appeal of that one. The painting I love is called Self-Portrait as the Allegory of Painting. It shows Artemisia herself, brush in hand, in the act of creation. She's not a victim in this painting, not defined by what was done to her. She's an artist, absorbed in her work, making something from nothing. Artemisia was raped as a teenager by her father's colleague. The trial was public and brutal, and she was subjected to torture to verify her testimony. But she went on to become one of the most celebrated painters of her era. Her trauma shaped her work. You can see it in the fierce women of her biblical scenes, but it didn't define her. She took what happened to her and transformed it into art that outlived everyone who hurt her. That's what I'm trying to do. Not through painting, but through policy, through advocacy, through the slow work of changing systems. Taking what was done to me and transforming it into something that helps others. Making meaning from pain. Is it enough?
Some days, yes.
Other days, I still feel the old rage, the sense of injustice, the wish that someone would pay for what they did. Those days are harder. But even on hard days, I know this. I am not who I was. I am not who they made me. I am someone new, built from the wreckage of someone old, and I'm still under construction. The scar fades. The story continues. And I get to decide how it ends. Hashtag epilogue. It's been 7 years now. I'm sitting in my office at the Bioethics Institute, looking out at the gray Seattle sky. Rain is streaking the window, and I have a cup of tea going cold beside me. On my desk is a draft of new federal guidelines for living donor evaluation, guidelines I helped write, waiting for my final review before submission. Daniel and I got married last spring. Small ceremony, just family and close friends, at a botanical garden outside the city. My parents came, looking older and proud. His kids were in the wedding party, awkward in their formal clothes, delighted to have a stepmother who lets them stay up late when they visit. I wore a dress that didn't hide my scar. It was visible above the neckline, a thin white line that most people didn't notice. But I knew it was there. I wanted it there. It's part of who I am. Evelyn sent a gift, a donation to Living Donor Support Network in my name. No card, no message. Just the gesture. I accepted it in the spirit it was given. An acknowledgement that some debts can never be fully repaid, only honored through ongoing contribution. Adrian sent nothing, and that was fine. We exist in parallel now, two people whose lives briefly intersected and then diverged. I wish him well, in the abstract way you wish well for strangers. The guidelines on my desk are dry-reading, bureaucratic language about psychological evaluation protocols, waiting periods, support resources. But they represent something real, systemic change, however incremental. When these guidelines are implemented, donors will be better protected. Some manipulation will be prevented. Some vulnerable people will be given the space to make truly informed decisions. It's not dramatic. It's not satisfying in the way revenge would be, but it's lasting. I pick up my pen and start reviewing the document, making small notes in the margins. Outside, the rain keeps falling. The world keeps turning. And I keep doing the work, not because it erases what happened to me, but because it transforms it into something larger than my own story. The weight of what we give. We give our organs, our time, our trust, our love. Sometimes we give to people who deserve it, and sometimes to people who don't. Sometimes our gifts are honored, and sometimes they're exploited. We can't always control what happens to the things we give away, but we can control what we do next. We can decide whether our losses become endings or beginnings. We can choose to be defined by what was taken or by what we build in its place. I chose to build. And that, in the end, is the only revenge that matters. For all the donors who gave more than they received, may you find your way back to yourselves.